Hi, and welcome back. Today, we're recapping the legendary story Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. You can find my full reading of the story on my channel, and there are also lots of summaries out on the internet, but this is just my personal take, and I hope you enjoy it. Let's get to it. The story begins with our main character, and it's not Dr. Jekyll or Mr. Hyde. It's a lawyer by the name of Mr. Utterson, and he's taking a stroll down London with his buddy and cousin, Mr. Enfield. They're talking, they're walking, they're itching for some tea, probably, it's London, and then they come across this big building with the large door. And at that point, Mr. Enfield is hit with the flashback about a hellish scene he'd seen here about a month ago during a casual stroll at 3 a.m., totally a normal time for a stroll. In any case, he tells old Mr. Utterson about a young girl he'd seen necking it down the sidewalk this way, and then a man briskly walking the opposite direction, and at the corner, boom, they collide. The hellish part of the story is when that man calmly, without hesitation, just tramples over the girl, leaving her on the floor crying in agony, just crying. Somebody cue the crying. Well, Enfield ain't having it. He chases down the perp, who he finds out goes by the name of Mr. Edward Hyde. Hyde doesn't want his name caught up in the stink, so he offers Mr. Enfield a price for his silence. Enfield, no fool, takes this man for £100 in the form of a check. But our boy Hyde makes a rookie mistake. See, he goes into that building where Mr. Utterson and Mr. Enfield are now standing, and he comes out with the check for £100 signed under the account of a Dr. Jekyll, a very popular and well-known man of science in the city of London. Utterson not only knows Jekyll, he's his closest friend, and for God's sake, he's his lawyer. In fact, Utterson helped prepare Dr. Jekyll's will. And why is this important? You see, Dr. Jekyll named one sole inheritor to his will, a fellow named Edward Hyde. How could this be? Who is this mystery man whom Jekyll left as his sole inheritor of his will? And how have I never met him before? Why would Dr. Jekyll name this wretched man as his heir? How did Mr. Hyde weasel his way into my friend's inheritance? Is it blackmail? Utterson is confused, disturbed, and bothered with an itch that must be scratched. Utterson starts his investigation by reaching out to a longtime and mutual friend by the name of Dr. Lanyon. He asks Dr. Lanyon if he knows this mysterious Mr. Hyde. Lanyon admits nothing. In fact, Lanyon believes Jekyll's gone wrong in the mind and doesn't speak to him much anymore. Now, Utterson's itch is reaching critical mass. He commits to walking by the building where Hyde trampled that girl over and over at all lights and all hours of the day until finally he catches someone in the dead of night rushing into the same building. And you guessed it, it's Edward Hyde. Utterson does his lawyer thing, interrogates the man, and leaves with the sense that this boy just ain't right. Let me explain. Hyde appeared deformed without any actual deformity, made an unpleasant smile, and presented himself with the murderous vibe, timid yet bold, and spoke with the whispering, broken voice to boot. Utterson summarizes it like this. If ever I'd seen Satan's signature on a face, it was on Edward Hyde's. Tell me they don't know how to spit some burns in the 19th century. As Jekyll's lawyer, it was time Utterson revealed this level 10 itch. He approaches Jekyll and says, if you're being blackmailed by this Edward Hyde, tell me, I can help you. Just say the word. Jekyll assures him there is no blackmail and asks Utterson to drop it. Put some cream on that itch and forget about it. Now we have one more scene before the whole plot begins to unravel. One more ghastly murder at the hands of the monstrous Mr. Hyde. An important man named Sir Danvers Carew, actually a member of Parliament, is seen bludgeoned to death by a man with a cane. Utterson, on the scene, finds a piece of that cane and instantly recognizes it because it's the same cane which he gifted Dr. Jekyll. Dun dun dun. Now we're walking over to Jekyll's place, huffing and puffing, like WTF bro, this friend of yours, Edward Hyde, just bludgeoned someone to death. Jekyll explains, no, he's gone now. Here's a letter from Mr. Hyde, and he's promised never to be seen again. Big sus moment if you ask me. Utterson takes Mr. Hyde's letter to have it analyzed, and you guessed it, it matches the writing of Dr. Jekyll. So again, Utterson is completely baffled why his friend Dr. Jekyll would forge this letter to cover up for this monstrous Mr. Hyde. Time passes, and Dr. Jekyll is rarely seen outside of his home. So, Utterson goes to see his friend, Dr. Lanyon. who you'll recall said Dr. Jekyll has some loose screws in the head. He finds Lanyon at home in total shock and then dies. But he leaves Utterson a letter. Bigger but, he leaves the letter with the note saying do not open it until Dr. Jekyll either dies or disappears. Ugh. Imagine, would you open it? Would you really hold back? I probably would open it, but good old Utterson honors Dr. Lanyon's request. In the meantime, Utterson receives an urgent call from Dr. Jekyll's butler, a Mr. Poole. Poole urges Utterson to come over right now because he thinks Hyde has kidnapped and possibly killed Dr. Jekyll, and they're both locked up in the laboratory. Well, this is it. Utterson goes over to the house. He's tired of this godforsaken itch up his butt. Him and Poole break down the laboratory door and find Hyde's body twitching on the floor and dead. They search the room, find a letter, but they don't find the body of Dr. Jekyll. Now we reach the two final chapters. Each one is the contents of the letter that Lanyon and Mr. Hyde left when they died, and these letters combined reveal all the shenanigans happening behind the scenes with Dr. Jekyll. First, Lanyon's letter reveals for the first time that he saw Dr. Jekyll drink the secret sauce, a chemical potion that literally morphed Jekyll into Mr. Hyde. This was just too much for Lanyon, and it set him off in a state of shock and eventual death, which we knew. Then we get to Dr. Jekyll's letter, a phenomenal chapter that you have to read or listen on my recording. Jekyll basically explains everything that's been happening to him this whole time, and why. Hyde writes about concealed pleasures, a profound duplicity of life, and that an individual is not only one, but truly two. We call this a duality. In the simplest form, we can say the duality is about good and evil. Perhaps a more nuanced take would be to say that humans are moral and desire-driven, rational and instinctive. Remember, Dr. Jekyll is a scientist and curious by nature. To him, this duality is not hypocritical or paradoxical, because both sides are authentic parts. So to answer why he pursued these transformations, it's because he wants to resolve the inner conflict, to unbind the two identities so they may be free and maybe even excel on their own. He writes, the unjust might go his way free from remorse of its upright twin, while the just could walk steadfastly on his upward path. So now we know why Dr. Jekyll conducted these experiments, but how did it go down? Dr. Jekyll essentially underestimates the dark side of Mr. Hyde. One night, in his sleep, Jekyll turns into Mr. Hyde without drinking that secret sauce. Mr. Hyde was having too much fun ravaging through the streets of London, and he wasn't about to let it go. As Dr. Jekyll loses control, he calls his buddy Dr. Lanyon to fetch the chemicals around town that he needs to make the potion to turn back to his normal self. This is when Lanyon saw the truth about Jekyll and then went into the state of shock. Jekyll's transformations continued, but soon the chemicals around town were in short supply. In fact, what little supplies he did find weren't working. It seemed inevitable that Dr. Jekyll would remain stuck as Mr. Hyde. So, in his last moments as Dr. Jekyll, he writes this letter that we're reading to Mr. Utterson explaining his experiments and that he's left with one solution. I think we can guess what that is. Jekyll would have to end the lives of both himself and Hyde. To that end, he locks himself in the lab and drinks a poison. Now, the plot is complete, and we arrive at the earlier point in the story when Utterson and the butler Mr. Poole break into the lab and find the body of Hyde lying on the floor, dead, with the letter next to him explaining this whole thing. It's clear the major theme of the story is the duality of human nature. Call it good and evil, just and unjust, rational and instinctive, moral and desire-driven. The essence of humans is split whichever way you phrase it. In other words, we are not inherently good or bad. We are complicated, and there is no straightforward answer about who we should be. Because if we were simply good, we wouldn't feel these inner conflicts. And if we were inherently bad, then this world would probably look a lot different. So my take is that the truth is somewhere in the middle, and that each of us must decide who we become at every moment in our lives. That's my take, and if you found this video helpful, slap that like, maybe drop a sub, and I'll see you next time.